Hey, gadget groupies! Blackberry is back in our offices with their first Android handset. I had a really disappointing time running the Passport through our camera tests. So let's see if the move to Google's operating system has changed that experience on the Priv. Starting off with some outdoor shots, we're treated to a crisp and colorful UHD video output. The data rate is similar to what we found on the LG G4, saving a space-conscious 30 megabit per second file. But the Priv is applying more contrast and saturation in finishing the file. I'll continue my crusade here against overexposure, as most phones, in my opinion, fall victim to making the scene brighter than they need to, and the Priv is no exception. Happily, we have very easily accessed exposure compensation, which can be adjusted while shooting video. You can't control a lot on this camera, but that's a major benefit. We get punchy, juicy colors which look very pleasant on blues and greens, though due to that storage-efficient bitrate, we will often see compression artifacting in uniform colors, especially the blue of the sky. I noticed a lot of issues when the camera was trying to contend with uniform blue with some wispy cloud trails layered on top. Oddly, browns and earthy tones can look a bit flat, minimizing the rust colors here, for example. Yellows get a bit sizzly as we start to clip these yellow flowers in direct sun, but dialing back the exposure a stop helps us preserve more info. Reds showcase the same problem many cameras have with trying to impress consumers with bright, vivid images. Red is tricky for all digital sensors to capture accurately, and here the combo of exposure and saturation is displaying more magenta than what these really look like in real life. Shooting a white flower in bright sunlight, the camera does a respectable job, which is again tremendously improved by dialing back the brightness. There aren't any white balance settings to manipulate, but the Priv did well across most tests, even properly exposing for warmer objects in cooler shaded lighting. The Passport focusing system was an absolute mess for me, and this might be the single biggest improvement I've seen from one manufacturer over successive phone generations. The Priv isn't bulletproof, and will often get confused in macro situations and busy scenes, but it's far more reliable for content creation than any previous Blackberry I've used. I just wish there was better error reporting for misfocus shots, as I get the green circle in situations where my subject is obviously not in focus. Speaking of macro, I can actually shoot macro shots. We've got very good performance close-up, nice detail. It's not the closest minimum focusing distance, but the combo of a larger half-inch sensor and a reasonably quick f2.2 aperture can give us a nicely pleasant bokeh blur. Softer backgrounds than we can achieve on the iPhone 6s, but not quite as blurry as what we might see on Samsung or LG. Into a walking test, the Priv utilizes a very subtle hardware stabilization when shooting UHD. It's very similar to Samsung's solution, which helps take the edge off movement like walking without displaying the more aggressive jello we might see from LG. There is a software plus hardware combo stabilization available when shooting 1080p, but I can't say I enjoy the result of shaking the lens and wiggling a cropped frame of the scene. It's often a bit buzzy or jittery, and you lose a good chunk of your field of view. I think an option for one style of stabilization or the other would actually produce better results in this day and age. Software stabilization has gotten really good at smoothing out bigger movements, and I like hardware stabilization better when the camera isn't moving as much. Our zoom test, the Priv does a very good job of balancing the image quality against blowing the subject up and applying sharpening to preserve detail. There isn't quite enough resolution on this sensor to really crop in this far, but the results here aren't terrible. Backing off a bit, using about half the zoom range gives us the best compromise between zoom and image integrity. Blackberry gets us really close to Apple-level performance here. The phone does a solid job of capturing movement at 30 frames per second in good light. The focusing system is a bit more active than I would prefer, and the exposure breathes more than I would like as darker and lighter cars pass in front of the lens, but overall we've got a decent scene with very good dynamic range. Our freeway test shows the same very good performance. Happily, we can hear a measured approach to noise reduction in the audio, recording in stereo, maintaining a great audio range, preserving tire noise over California's terrible roads, and minimizing distortion from stripping too much of the ambient noise out. There's no slow motion to be found here, but Blackberry does have a high-quality 1080p 60 frame per second mode. As this video is being rendered in 30 frames per second to match the UHD video settings, I can't show how smooth that is, but we can use it to create a half-speed slow motion. On a transition test moving from dark to bright and back, the phone slides through adjustments with fairly noticeable steps, and it's not a particularly pleasant bloom or slide between different exposure settings. Worse still, the phone loses focus and starts hunting quite a bit while adjusting exposure. There's definitely room for improvement here. Now for some nighttime shots, overexposure becomes an even bigger problem here than during our daytime tests. When left to its own devices, the Priv radically overexposes, producing a way brighter scene than we would ever need to represent here. There's plenty of light to expose off of. There's no need to push the ISO this high. Just look at how much better this shot is when we cut the light by 2 full stops. There's less noise, and we preserve a lot more detail in the scene thanks to less aggressive image processing. We can still clearly see buildings, cars, and people, and we don't blow out the signs and billboards. This is fantastic city lighting performance. We just had to manually adjust the camera away from what it wanted to do. Ditto our creepy tunnel, we lose contrast and range when the phone pushes exposure this high. The shot looks washed out and doesn't represent how eerie this tunnel is at night. Dialing it back, we suffer less noise, and I prefer this exposure for color information as well. Moving to scenes with less light, however, the Priv gets a lot closer to the correct feel of the scene. Our creepy gate is pretty close in terms of lighting and white balance. This is lit by a really ugly yellow security light, so the color here should look kinda gross. A very minor tweak to the exposure delivers the right mood for an alley shot like this. Even with a penchant for overexposing, the camera's doing a great job at nailing nighttime lighting and white balance, properly showcasing the color temperature differences between these two security lights. A flower lit by a porch light yards away shows the same. The Priv is erring on a slightly warmer white balance, which is fitting for a pink flower lit by yellow light. Blackberry avoids the trap of overcorrecting for warm light, which we saw on the iPhone 6s. Lastly, a flower in almost total darkness. This shot looks terrible, but it shows incredible focusing performance from Blackberry. Apple and Samsung both failed to lock focus under similar conditions. Only LG to date has managed to lock onto a subject like this. Very impressive, considering the Priv lacks the laser focusing system employed by LG. Taking a look at some still photos, the Priv uses a native 4:3 aspect ratio sensor, so the full 18 megapixel resolution pics are kinda square-ish. Funnily, there isn't an option to shoot widescreen, as the only pre-crop option available is to shoot in squares for Instagram. Photos here display a lot of the same characteristics as the videos showed. There's an overall tendency to overexpose, reds become magenta-y, and nighttime shots are maybe even a touch worse than their video counterparts. We're able to land some really pretty macro shots though. It's odd but welcome that browns and earthy colors seem to look better in still photos than on video. And I'm not a huge fan of HDR photography on phones, but Blackberry gets a bit closer to the kind of performance I would want to see here. Instead of just making shadows brighter, the phone will occasionally rein in highlights too. This can make a photo feel a bit muted or dull the contrast of a shot, but it's a little bit closer in performance to HDR champs like the iPhone 6s. The major weakness for fun features here is panorama mode. Instead of using the newer scanning system that Apple, LG, and Samsung employ, the Blackberry is a throwback to the older way of lining up individual frames. It's a lot more likely that seams won't blend as well and that you'll see tearing on objects which fall in between separate shots. Processing also takes a really long time compared to LG, which uses the same Qualcomm 808 processor. The hardware stabilization is very effective in holding the lens still for low light shots. Back to those pink flowers, this was my first and only attempt at capturing these, and it was easier to grab this shot than on the iPhone. Even in ridiculously low light situations like the total darkness flower shot, the camera can produce some surprising images. So where's that leave us with the camera on the Blackberry Priv? This is so much better. The Passport was a painful and frustrating camera to use, and the Priv is a radical improvement. It's a huge leap for Blackberry. I've always enjoyed the corporate focus and business professional hardware, but in this day and age, there's no excuse for having a mediocre camera on a premier smartphone. The Priv isn't going to win many battles against Samsung and LG, but it's a far more competitive offering for people who care about solid photo and video output. It's the most improved camera of the year, and even though there are still a few quirks I'd like to see ironed out, it's a charming little shooter that I don't feel I need to warn people away from. Better than just not being a compromise, it's actually a pretty fun camera to use. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more reviews like these, and I would not be able to continue producing on this channel if you all weren't out there supporting it by hitting the fan funding, shopping via my Amazon affiliate links, grabbing a loot crate or a free audiobook, or by sharing my videos on your favorite social sites like Reddit, Facebook, Google+, and the Twitter. So please keep bringing more cool people to the party. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next review.